Welcome to episode 3 of Let's Ruin My Algorithm. In this show, I take a random music genre that's been chosen by a computer, I listen to it for a day or so, and then I give my impressions of it. Of course, I'm not going to be an expert in this genre. This is often the first time I'm listening to this genre. The whole point of the show is just to experience different kinds of music, see what they're like, see if I can find something new to listen to, and just generally expand what I listen to in general. So come along with me and let's discover some new music. This week we are going to be listening to Detroit indie. So as that name would suggest, it's indie music, particularly indie rock from Detroit. Indie rock, I think by nature or indie in general, not just indie rock, by nature is a pretty broad term. The moniker comes from bands that originally were from independent labels. But now I think indie, especially indie rock, has become more of a sound than you have to be within an independent label. I'm sure some people would disagree with me on that, especially people who are really into indie rock who don't like the whole major record label system. But in a lot of ways, indie is a sound, I think. Originally, the whole indie thing worked well because being outside of the major label system, it gave the artists a little bit more freedom to experiment and create different sounds that wasn't just, especially with rock, wasn't just that standard commercial rock sound. But over time, as indie artists are drawing influence from each other, it does create that specific sound. I think personally there can be a fine line sometimes between what would be considered indie and what would be considered alt rock, but that's my opinion, and you still really can't really pinpoint exactly what indie is. With that, personally, you can tell I'm having a bit of trouble defining indie. I read some less than complimentary definitions of what indie is. I think one person said it's just a bunch of white guys playing guitar. I don't think you can narrow it down quite like that, but I think indie is one of those genres that you know it when you hear it. And that is assuming that it's the sound of indie, and we're not purely defining indie as music that is outside of the major record label system. With all that in mind, Detroit indie is also harder to define. Obviously, it's from Detroit. It's groups of independent artists from Detroit. They all have their own influences. They all have their own sound. But like indie in general, they're probably drawing influence off each other from their specific scene in Detroit, which is why there were some similarities between the sounds. But at the same time, what I found was it wasn't cohesive as saying, like rock music or blues or, these are all very different artists who have their own sounds, their own influences. Just a bit of background on Detroit indie and Detroit music in general. Detroit, if you know a little bit about music, you probably know that Detroit has a pretty big musical history. Motown obviously is one of the big genres that came out of Detroit, that Motown sound, soul music and rhythm and blues that sound very different from a lot of other rhythm and blues and soul from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like if you listen to Motown soul versus like Atlantic soul, very different sounding types of music. From there, Detroit also had bands like the MC5 and of course Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Those are big names, and of course there's Kiss, who had the anthem Detroit Rock City. So look, Detroit has a long and storied history of music, and some really good music has come out of Detroit in the past. If we're talking more indie, of course there's Jack White, and the White Stripes are from Detroit. White Stripes, probably one of the most successful indie and rock acts of recent history to come out of Detroit, and it's clear that Detroit really knows its music. A lot of the bands I think I've mentioned, whether it's the White Stripes or even looking at the MC5 or the Stooges or even the Motown bands, they do have that independent feel to them. They've never really gone with what the rest of the country is doing musically. And even to this day, Detroit has a big punk scene and a hip hop scene as well. And bands like the MC5, they started that. MC5, you could never really say that they were, label friendly. So they have a history of independence and a history of creativity in the Detroit music scene. So I'm not surprised that Detroit has a thriving indie scene to this day. I don't really know enough about Detroit to say, oh, they're just different over there. But obviously they do their own thing when it comes to music. So that's kind of how I see Detroit indie coming out and becoming its own thing. To me, after listening to quite a bit of Detroit indie, I listened to hours and hours and hours of it. A lot of it seems very upbeat, a bit jangly, but I think a lot of that I found because one of the bigger bands that were on a lot of the playlists I listened to, called the High Strung, I listened to a lot of them, and they were kind of the more upbeat, jangly sort of sound. I quite liked them. So the initial impression that I got of Detroit indie was actually more, I think, an initial impression of the High Strung and how they sound. And it kind of overshadowed what I thought Detroit indie was. And then I started kind of always trying to listen for that sound when I think that sound was actually more of a specific band. But throughout most of the songs that I listened to, it's a very groove-based genre. And I didn't hear a lot of hooks and riffs that you hear in a lot of rock, and especially a lot of indie rock where there's, riff-based hook. Instead, a lot of the music I found, the hook was in the groove. It was in the beat. And yeah, not as many riffs, just more rhythm guitar. And it was just in that rhythm and beat where you got the hook. So it's not those indie songs that you can bop along and sing the riff or sing the chorus. It's you feel it. It's something that you're feeling. But yeah, I'm not saying that there's no hooks in Detroit indie. There are, but it's just in a different way from a lot of rock and roll that you might be interested in. And look, I feel like Detroit indie is a little bit heavier sometimes than a lot of the indie that gets a lot of radio play. Of course, the indie that gets radio play and chart toppers, that is more accessible. That's more popular music for for a reason. That's why it gets popular. Obviously, heavier styles of music often aren't going to be as popular. And so some of these bands were a little bit heavier, and they're not designed to be, chart toppers or extremely accessible. I'm not saying it's inaccessible. I'm just saying that it's a bit heavier and a little bit less friendly than the chart topping indie, especially all that indie music that was just played, 20 years ago. That's kind of when I was growing up, hearing all that indie music that was very, very radio friendly and very, very popular. It was lighter and it was easier to listen to. This is a little bit different, a little bit heavier, but again, Detroit has a big history of punk and heavier music, and I'm sure they're drawing on all these artists are drawing off of that. And with that, I mentioned, I had trouble finding a little bit of cohesiveness throughout these artists to find one sound, but that's indie for you, isn't it? And I'm sure that these artists are drawing influence off each other, but they're also drawing influence off other bands, whether they're from Detroit or not. So you can hear, a specific sound. And, last week when I was talking about cosmic death metal, or not last week, no, 2 weeks ago when I was talking about Ethiopian jazz, how, you can hear that the African elements to it, and Spotify had started to say all African music is the same, at least on the playlists. And you can hear you can hear what African music sounds like, but obviously a band from Ethiopia is going to have different musical traditions than a band from Nigeria. They're different countries and different cultures. But in the same way with like Western music, a band from New York is going to sound different from a band from San Francisco, but there's still going to be similarities there from from a genre. So in the same way, from Detroit, there's similarities because all these people are playing and hanging out and getting influence from each other, but it's not as cohesive as to say that this is a very specific genre. So overall, yeah, Detroit indie, it's pretty varied because it's more of a scene than it is a specific sound. I quite enjoyed listening to it though. It's designed to be popular music. It was easier than the first two episodes where I was listening to Ethiopian jazz and then cosmic death metal. You know, this is closer to the music that I listen to regularly. Some great standout tracks. First one is The Luck You Got by The High Strung. You would know this one as the intro music to Shameless. So I had heard this song. I'm a big Shameless fan, so I've heard this song way too much already, and I quite like it. It's a banger. I'll say that. It's a bit of a banger. It's indie, just the right amount of poppy, I think, and just a lot of fun. It's not really one with a chorus that you can really, catch. As I said, it's not this style of music. It's not, doesn't have the sort of hooks that you might be used to in popular rock, but it is catchy. I quite liked it. It's just a good rock song, honestly, easy. Another song I liked was Playing the Party by Electric Honey. A lot of good drive to the song. Once again, not a lot of hook to it, like indie, but it's got the rhythm and the groove. It also felt like one of those songs, if you were already familiar with Electric Honey and you went and saw them perform it live or got played at a club in Detroit, this would be a song that everybody be singing and everybody be jumping along to and everybody love it. For people who are already familiar with this song, it's going to be one of those anthems. And that's what caught me. And it's it's a song that I want to listen to again and again, and then learn it and turn it up loud in the car and sing along. Obviously, you're not going to get that listening to it only once. You need to learn the song, but it's one of those songs.
Just want to be alone with you.
Truffle Trip by the Savage Seven. A little bit heavier. As I said, some of these songs are a little bit heavier. Most of the tracks in the Detroit indie that I listened to didn't have like heavy distortion or anything. Maybe some overdrive or some light distortion on the guitars. But this one actually had a large amount of distortion. Guitars, the song changed the formula, I think, for what you're hearing out of Detroit indie quite a lot. Different from some of the other bands, which is why it was a bit of a standout. Once again, not catchy, but it had that groove that made you want to keep listening to it. Another great one, Mona and Emmy by the Frontier Ruckus. Look, this one stood out because it's actually more of an alt country song than what I call indie rock. The Frontier Ruckus, they are an alt country band from the Detroit area. So once again, like, how are we defining indie? It doesn't need to be indie rock. Is it artists who are not on a major record label? I don't know whether I'm saying that this is Detroit indie or alt country from Detroit, but I liked it. I like alt country, so obviously that's going to stand out.
When I punch out, I wanna set the night to bitter flames a licking, the town and all the passion stricken down.
Finally, The Straggle Is Real by the Devious Ones. This was a poppy one, fun and poppy, but with a bit of a punk influence. Again, Detroit has a great punk history. So, obviously artists from Detroit are going to be drawing on some of those punk influences of the city. Look, once again, no hook, but the beat. Boppy, fun, easy to listen to.
The spots on your jeans can only mean one thing, your night is through.
If you do want to listen to any of these artists, any of these songs, I'm going to link all of them in the description. Have a listen. Listen to all 5 that I've recommended. Listen to more. Tell me what you like. Do you agree with my top 5 Detroit indie songs? Do you disagree? Listen to more than those 5. Tell me what you like. Maybe you'll find some gems that I didn't find. Let's start a discussion, and I'd love to hear what you think of this genre. But just kind of close things out, my overall impression on Detroit indie, it's not hard to like this music. It's obviously not as commercially focused as the really commercially successful indie rock, but it's still, accessible music, especially compared to something like cosmic death metal that we spoke about last week. It's just rock and roll, just, with different production values and lower production, easy to make, easy to consume rock and roll. Why can you not like that? That's great. I don't think it has those hooks. It's the beat, it's the feel, it's the vibe. But they were infectious. They were good. They were fun. But once again, not a lot of cohesiveness between the different bands. It's more of a scene than it is a specific genre. But with that, it's a different way of looking at rock. Every city has their scene. Every city has their sound. And it was really interesting to kind of dive into the sound of one specific scene that from a city that I've never even been to. I live in Australia. I've never been to Detroit. But yeah, I think it all harks back to Detroit's just general history of music and how much music they've made over the years in Detroit, and how much we owe them for the influences that they've brought other artists. Detroit has had its big share of great artists that I've already mentioned, and I've mentioned more recently with the White Stripes, and I was kind of going into this thinking we're just going to be hearing a whole bunch of White Stripes clones, and none of these bands sound like the White Stripes, not remotely like the White Stripes. The White Stripes are very riff heavy, whereas all the bands I listened to were more rhythmic than that. And so, you would forgive some Detroit artists for trying to recreate that White Stripes sound to get the commercial success that the White Stripes had. And none of them did that. They're all doing their own thing. And that's what was actually a little surprising and refreshing. I thought I was in for 2 days of White Stripes cover bands and nothing close to the White Stripes. But, with all respect, obviously, to Jack White, because, his music is on the popular side of indie and he knows what he's doing. He's a great guitarist, he's a great songwriter, and he's popular for a reason. With this, I also like that the style was a little bit heavier than what you get for more commercially successful indie music. I know I went on and on last week about how cosmic death metal was a little bit too heavy for me, but I like something a little bit heavier, not too light. And so I like this. I like that it wasn't just commercial, easy to listen to indie music. It was a little bit more challenging, but not really difficult. So it's a varied genre, and there's a lot of good bands to discover, and I really encourage you to take a listen to the 5 that I've listed here. All the links are in the description. Have a listen. Tell me what you think of Detroit indie. Were there bands that I missed? Are you from Detroit? And, what's the scene like? Let me know, and let's have a chat in the comments. See you next week.